Sirens scream through the streets of Yaoundé. The air is thick with tear gas, the smell of burnt tires, and the sound of fear. For decades, this city has been called the quiet heart of Central Africa. But tonight, its silence has been broken. Paul Biya, a man who has ruled Cameroon longer than most of its citizens have been alive, has just declared victory for his 8th presidential term. He is 92 years old. His supporters call it stability. His critics call it the end of hope. But for many young Cameroonians, it feels like waking up inside a nightmare that never ends. Across the city shop doors are locked, soldiers guard every corner, and mothers whisper prayers for their sons not to go outside. France 24 calls it a country under tension. But to those living it, this is not tension, it's exhaustion. 40 years of promises, 40 years of watching the same face appear on the ballot. And now even the act of voting feels like a ritual of despair. One analyst put it bluntly, "You can't win a football match when your opponent is also the referee." His words cut deeper than any speech, because this isn't just about one man clinging to power. It's about an entire nation trapped inside its own reflection, a democracy that no longer believes in itself. So we ask tonight, can Cameroon still find a way out of this endless circle of power? Or is this the beginning of a reckoning that will echo far beyond its borders, from Yaoundé to Washington, from Douala to Ouagadougou? Because what's unfolding here is not just another election. It's a mirror for the whole of Africa, a continent questioning whether democracy still serves its people or merely serves those who never let go. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, stay with us. Because this story is not about one president, it's about the soul of a continent. When the National Election Commission of Cameroon finally announced the results, it was meant to be a moment of celebration, proof that democracy still functioned. Instead, it became the spark that set a weary nation ablaze. Paul Biya, at 92 years old, was declared the winner with 55.66% of the vote. His main challenger, Ibrahim Traoré, a former minister in Biya's own government just 3 months earlier, received a little over 35%. On paper, the result looked clear. But on the streets, nothing was settled. In Garoua, Traoré's hometown, gunfire echoed before dawn. 2 people were confirmed dead after clashes between protesters and security forces. In Yaoundé, armored trucks blocked the main boulevards. Reporters described a city turned ghostly, lights-out shops, shuttered families peering from behind curtains. "We are prisoners in our own homes," one woman said quietly to the camera. For most of the world, Cameroon is a blur on the map. But for those who live there, the election is not about politics, it's about survival. Over 40 years, Paul Biya's name has become a synonym for power itself. He has outlasted coups, recessions, rebellions, and even time. And yet his latest victory exposes not strength, but fragility. Political analyst Brice Mollant told France 24. The Cameroonians have realized once again that you can't win a football match when your opponent is also the referee. That single sentence summed up an entire generation's disillusionment. The youth, who make up 60% of Cameroon's population, watched as their future was decided by a man older than their grandfathers. For them, the election didn't feel stolen, it felt meaningless. Behind Biya's victory lies what Molot calls le socle granitique, the granite base of loyalty built from decades of patronage. 3 central regions, center, south, and east, remain his fortress. In these areas, loyalty is not just political, it's transactional. There exists a waiting list, a vast network of people promised power jobs or recognition in exchange for unwavering allegiance. They are the system's lifeblood, men and women who believe that if they just remain loyal a little longer, their reward will come. This waiting list explains why the regime endures despite exhaustion and cynicism. It isn't just one man staying in power, it's thousands depending on him to stay. But cracks are showing. Even Biya's granite base is fracturing. The northern regions that once supported him have drifted toward opposition. And most astonishingly, official results claim Biya won in the Anglophone regions, the same territories where government forces have fought a bloody insurgency since 2016. To many, this was not only improbable, but insulting. How could a region devastated by war vote for the man who presided over it? As dusk fell on election night, Yaoundé turned silent. Soldiers stood at every intersection, their rifles gleaming under dim streetlights. Radio stations played soft music, a familiar tactic to fill the air when words could be dangerous. At the presidential palace, the old leader smiled faintly as he addressed the nation. He promised unity, reform, and youth employment, the same words he'd spoken in 1997, in 2004, in 2011, and again in 2018. But outside the palace walls, young people held candles instead of flags. Some prayed, others cursed. For them, the problem was no longer who ruled, but why nothing ever changed. That night, as the last ballots were burned and the internet slowed to a crawl, Cameroon crossed a quiet line. It was no longer a question of winning or losing an election. It became a question of whether the nation itself could still believe in one. The morning after the results, Cameroon no longer felt like a country, it felt like a wound. From Yaoundé to Douala, young men filled the streets, shouting, waving torn posters, holding up phones that streamed live until the signals were cut. The military arrived within minutes. Tear gas gunshots and the dull roar of armored trucks drowned out the sound of protest. By nightfall, the smell of burning rubber mixed with prayers. For decades, Paul Biya's regime had ruled through silence, the kind of silence enforced by fear and fatigue. But this time, the silence cracked. Across social media, a single phrase began to spread like wildfire. 92 years old, we can't breathe. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a confession of suffocation under a system that had outlived its legitimacy. Brice Molo, the political sociologist interviewed on France 24, warned that the question had changed. It's no longer about who won or lost. It's about what happens next when a country is burning. He was right. By the second night, protests were no longer coordinated or even political. They were emotional, raw, and desperate. Churches were vandalized, traditional leaders were chased from their compounds, and the government shut down parts of the internet, a familiar pattern for regimes trying to erase their own panic. At first, the state television replayed old patriotic songs pretending calm, but everyone knew the illusion had collapsed. What was once called le socle granitique, the granite base of Biya's power, was beginning to crumble. In the northern provinces, once loyal to the ruling party, villages declared symbolic independence. In Garoua, crowds burned campaign posters and shouted Bakari's name in defiance. Yet even Bakari, the challenger, seemed powerless. His early declaration of victory was ignored. His supporters arrested his movement, strangled by bureaucracy. The opposition, divided for years, now found itself split between outrage and resignation. Cabral Libye, who placed third with just 3%, shocked many by congratulating Biya, while other figures like Akere Muna demanded a national dialogue. But dialogue requires trust, and trust had vanished. France 24's correspondent described the capital as une ville fantôme, a ghost city. Streets, once full of commerce, now echoed with emptiness. Women sold food behind half-closed doors. Students whispered that they wanted to flee to Ghana or Nigeria. And everywhere, people repeated the same sentence: "It will not end this time." The crisis, Mollet said, had reached a point of irreversibility. The legitimacy of the electoral system had collapsed completely. No one believed in the Constitutional Council, an institution Biya himself had created decades ago to bless every victory. When the referee is also the captain, Mollet noted the game is over before it begins. But beneath the fear, something else was stirring, a strange kind of awakening. For the first time in years, Cameroonians were talking openly about the unthinkable transition, change, and even life after Biya. Young activists began using encrypted messaging apps to organize community aid and neighborhood patrols, not to fight, but to protect each other from the chaos they expected. "We are not rebels," one student said, "we are witnesses." That night, while state TV declared peace, Yaoundé was lit by fires not of war, but of clarity. A generation realized that the man ruling them would never willingly leave, and that waiting for permission to be free was a form of surrender. The protests may fade, the soldiers may regain control, but something irreversible has already happened. The illusion of stability has died. And when illusions die, nations either collapse or begin to awaken. By the end of that week, the smoke had settled, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise that came before it. Cameroon, a nation once known for its calm, now looked like a country waking up after a storm only to realize the house was gone. Shops reopened cautiously. Schools remained closed in several cities. Soldiers stood watch near churches and bus stations. But beneath the appearance of normalcy, a profound shift had begun, not in the streets but in the hearts of Cameroonians. The social contract that once held the nation together had quietly collapsed. For decades, Paul Biya had ruled not by inspiration, but by inertia, a delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and routine. Each new election, no matter how hollow, gave people the illusion of participation. But this time, the illusion had failed. People voted and nothing changed. They protested and nothing changed. They spoke and no one listened. What remained was exhaustion, and in that exhaustion, a new kind of clarity. The economic consequences were immediate. Foreign investors froze projects wary of unrest. Tourism vanished overnight. The CFA franc lost value, pushing food prices higher. Youth unemployment, already above 35%, spiked even further. Yet the government's response was as predictable as it was tragic silence, followed by repression disguised as order. Opposition figures were summoned for questioning. Journalists disappeared from the airwaves. And on state TV, the president's speeches played on repeat, as if replaying the words could make them true. But perhaps the most profound effect wasn't political or economic, it was psychological. A generation that grew up believing change would come through ballots now saw those ballots burn. "We are the generation of waiting," one student in Douala told a reporter. "Our parents waited for independence to mean freedom. We waited for democracy to mean hope. Now we wait for something else, maybe collapse." In many neighborhoods, informal networks began replacing the absent state. Community elders organized food drives for families cut off by curfews. Churches became shelters for displaced youth. Some towns in the Anglophone regions declared autonomous zones, not as rebellion, but as acts of survival. Meanwhile, within Biya's ruling circle, tension grew. Ministers whispered about succession behind closed doors, each maneuvering for the day the old man would finally be too weak to appear on camera. The battle for the post-Biya era had already begun, even as the official narrative pretended everything was under control. Across Cameroon's universities, professors cautiously introduced forbidden topics: federalism, decentralization, even the idea of a multinational state. The taboo was breaking. As Brice Mollet warned, "We must stop pretending the nation-state model still works. Cameroon is too diverse, too wounded to fit inside one flag drawn by colonial hands." That statement struck a nerve. It echoed through the intellectual circles of Douala and Yaoundé, through WhatsApp groups of young lawyers and journalists. For the first time, people dared to ask, what if Cameroon was never meant to be ruled by one man, one tribe, one system? It was a dangerous question, but also a liberating one. Because beneath the ashes of burned posters and shattered promises, something fragile yet real was emerging: the courage to imagine another Cameroon. From Washington to Paris, the news of Paul Biya's 8th victory barely made the front pages. The headlines were cautious, the tone diplomatic: Cameroon president re-elected amid tensions. Nothing about blood in the streets, nothing about the smell of fear. The world had seen this movie before and perhaps grown numb to its sequels. In the corridors of Western diplomacy, Biya's longevity is often described as stability, but to millions of Cameroonians it feels more like paralysis. Still, few governments dared to challenge him. For France, Biya remains a trusted partner in a region besieged by jihadist violence and economic volatility. For the United States, Cameroon is a strategic ally in the fight against Boko Haram. Stability, even if manufactured, remains preferable to uncertainty. But this cautious silence comes at a price. In the words of a former U.S. diplomat, "Every time we prioritize short-term stability over democratic integrity, we mortgage the region's future." Washington knows the risks. If Cameroon implodes, the ripple effects could reach Nigeria, Chad, and even the fragile Sahel alliance that stretches across West Africa. Yet no one wants to be the one to push Biya out or to deal with what comes after him. France 24. The French state channel reported on the unrest with professional detachment. Yet between the lines, a subtle unease could be felt: the realization that the France-Afrique order, that post-colonial web of influence, is starting to unravel. In neighboring countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, young leaders are rejecting Paris outright. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, for example, speaks openly about breaking the chains of colonial democracy. His name now circulates on African social media as a symbol of authentic leadership, while Biya's image evokes fatigue and decline. Even in the U.S., think tanks have begun to draw comparisons. A recent policy paper from the Wilson Center noted, "What's happening in Cameroon mirrors the broader fatigue of Western-style governance across Africa. Young populations demand sovereignty, not speeches." That word sovereignty now dominates African political discourse. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Conakry to Dar es Salaam, it is no longer about aid, but about agency. While Biya clings to the vestiges of a Cold War relationship, a new generation of African leaders is forging alliances beyond the traditional West with Russia, China, and each other. In that context, Cameroon's election feels not only tragic, but outdated, a remnant of an era when democracy was measured by ballots, not by belief. The world watches, but few intervene, as though the continent were condemned to repeat its own disappointments. Yet beneath the indifference, a shift is underway. Africa's political gravity is moving from Paris and Washington toward Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey cities, once dismissed as peripheral, now becoming laboratories of independence. For Western observers, the question is no longer whether Africa is stable, but whether the West itself is ready for an Africa that no longer asks for permission. Night falls again over Yaoundé. The streets are quieter now, but it's the kind of quiet that follows exhaustion, not peace. Behind the thick curtains of old apartment blocks, families whisper the same question: how much longer can this go on? Paul Biya, frail yet unshaken, begins his 8th term with the same words he has used for decades: unity, reform, stability. But even his voice sounds tired now, like a recording that's been replayed too many times. Around him, the same faces smile for the cameras, pretending that the country hasn't changed. But outside, in the hearts of millions, something irreversible has begun: the unmasking of illusion. Cameroon's election is no longer just about one aging ruler. It's a symbol, a reflection of what happens when democracy becomes theater and power becomes inheritance. A reflection that stretches far beyond Cameroon's borders. Across Africa, the same story repeats itself: familiar names, recycled promises, elections that no longer convince. From Abidjan to Conakry, from Dakar to Kampala, people are beginning to ask whether democracy has simply become another word for control. And yet, amid the despair, there is something quietly powerful. In the markets of Douala, in the universities of Buea, in the churches of Garoua, a new language is forming: the language of dignity. It doesn't speak of coups or chaos. It speaks of self-respect, of the right to be heard, of the courage to imagine freedom differently. In neighboring Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré once said, "True sovereignty begins when people stop waiting for permission to be free." Those words now echo far beyond the Sahel, because what Cameroon faces today, others may face tomorrow, when nations finally tire of borrowed systems and begin to write their own. The question is not whether Africa will rise; it already is. The question is whether the world will recognize that rise for what it is: a demand for authenticity, for justice, for the right to define democracy on African terms. So as the lights dim in Yaoundé and the headlines fade, remember this: every empire, every illusion of permanence eventually meets its reckoning. And sometimes that reckoning begins not with war, but with a whisper from a tired people who have simply had enough. If you believe that truth should not fear power, share this story. If you believe that Africa deserves its own voice, subscribe, because the next revolution may not come with guns, but with truth itself.